A quiet reckoning in Evergreen Park. Some stories don't start with a shout, they begin with a silence, so thick you can feel it. A woman walks alone, calm, focused. A patrol car pulls up beside her. The officer steps out, confident, commanding, certain he's in control. He sees someone to intimidate. She sees a threat she's faced before. He raises his voice. She stays still. Then, without warning, he kicks her phone, hits the pavement, glass splintering like ice. But she doesn't flinch, doesn't run. She reaches inside her coat and pulls out her badge. Not just any badge, a federal badge. And suddenly, the man who thought he held power is frozen. He didn't just target a woman, he attacked a federal agent. And now he has nowhere to hide. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? It started like most mornings for Danielle Porter, a quiet ritual of breath, rhythm, and distance from the noise of the world she served. The sun was just slipping through the thin veil of dawn, casting warm streaks across the pavement of Evergreen Park, a pocket of stillness nestled between aging picket fences and manicured silence. Birds murmured in the tree line, sprinklers hissed faintly in the distance, and the gravel under her shoes crunched in a familiar, soothing rhythm. She wasn't running for her health, not at her age. Not like the young ones pounding pavement. To chase youth, Danielle ran to quiet her mind. After 30 years chasing digital ghosts for the Bureau, solitude wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. She wore simple black track pants and a grey half-zip. Her hair was pulled back neatly. Nothing flashy, just clean lines and soft cotton. Her hands stayed relaxed at her sides. Her steps were measured, deliberate. Each inhale stretched through her chest. Each exhale melted the weight that had no name but lived permanently between her shoulders. She'd chosen this park years ago for one reason. No one recognized her here. No one whispered FBI or agent or ma'am with too much deference or too much doubt. Here she could just be a woman moving forward. That was the point. Keep moving forward. She passed the old couple with the sheltie and gave a small nod. They nodded back, wordless. Further down, a teenage boy doing chin-ups grunted through his headphones. Everything was as it should be until it wasn't. There was no shout, no tire screech, just a change in the air. The kind that tells you something's watching before your eyes catch up. Danielle didn't turn her head. Instead, she loosened her stride, dropped her shoulders slightly, and let her breath shift from calm to alert. The change was internal, invisible, but practiced. She curved right off the paved path onto a small, dirt trail looping near the lake's edge. A hawk screamed above. She glanced toward the water and caught the reflection of a parked patrol car, barely visible through the trees. No lights, no movement, just presence. Her eyes flicked forward again. Her hands tightened once, then released. She didn't stop. Not yet. At the next bench, she slowed, crouched, and pretended to tie her shoe. Her fingers moved absently, her ears doing the real work. The birds hadn't gone quiet, which meant no sudden motion, but she felt the subtle hum of someone deciding. Something behind glass. Her voice stayed silent, but her mind whispered, "Don't escalate, don't assume, but don't you dare dismiss it either." When she stood, she adjusted her jacket, wiped a phantom speck from her sleeve, and walked. Still nothing. That's what unsettled her most. She reached the junction where the trail met the small side lot, and saw it. A white patrol car pulled in diagonally, just enough to partially block the path. Engine off, window cracked. A man in uniform sat motionless inside, arm resting on the sill like he'd been waiting longer than just this morning. His sunglasses caught the glare, obscuring his eyes, but she didn't need them to feel the weight of his stare. She knew that weight. It was the stare of evaluation, not curiosity, but judgment. She stepped off the path and moved forward slowly, intentionally, keeping a safe but firm distance. The officer didn't open his door, but his head tilted slightly. She could almost feel the words forming before they came. And then there they were. "Morning," he said, voice rough like gravel under pressure. "You live around here?" Danielle met his gaze evenly. "Just out for a run." "Unhung," he muttered, not writing anything down, not shifting his posture. "We've had reports, people not from the neighborhood." She didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. The air between them spoke enough. "I'm not disturbing anyone," she said finally, voice steady but low, "just jogging." The man opened the door slowly. The sound of metal unsealing from rubber sliced through the still air like a warning bell. He stepped out. Stocky build, stiff shoulders, right hand close to his belt. She caught his nameplate, Hale. She didn't flinch. "You got ID on you?" he asked, less a question, more an order trying to dress itself up. "Do you have probable cause?" She replied, not loud, not rude, just correct. There was a time to explain, to diffuse, but that time hadn't arrived. Not yet. He took one step forward, closing some of the space, and smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Ma'am, you're being difficult. Danielle kept her feet planted. I'm being legal. His smile twitched. You're smart, huh? She didn't answer. His tone said, enough, not admiration, not surprise, but discomfort. She saw it, a flicker of calculation, the kind that comes just before something shifts. And in that flicker, Danielle realized the shape of this moment. This wasn't about suspicion. This was about challenge. And to men like Officer Hale, challenge meant disrespect. She didn't pull her badge. Not yet. Not unless forced. The badge wouldn't protect her from a wrong decision made in the span of a breath. It would come out when it meant something, when the truth had to speak louder than fear. The wind shifted slightly. A jogger passed on the opposite path, glanced briefly their way, but didn't slow. Hale noticed his jaw clenched. Name, he snapped. I'm not required to give it, she said quietly. He didn't answer. Not with words. He just stood there, staring like he'd reached a fork in his mind. Back down or press forward. And in that long moment of silence, Danielle knew something he wasn't going to de-escalate. He didn't know how. She scanned his posture, his feet, the way his chest rose. He wasn't afraid. He was offended. And sometimes, for certain men in certain uniforms, that was more dangerous than rage. Danielle exhaled slowly. No fear in her chest, only calculation. She hadn't come here to fight, but she was no longer under the illusion that silence would protect her, and in that stillness between them, in the space where sunlight filtered through dying leaves and the grass held its breath, she understood. Whatever happened next wouldn't be about law. It would be about ego, and she would not yield to that. He stepped fully into view, like a storm cloud emerging from a clear sky, not with haste or drama, but with the quiet certainty of someone who'd already made up his mind. Officer Brian Hale shut his cruiser door with deliberate slowness, the metal latching with a mechanical finality that echoed louder than it should. He adjusted the collar of his uniform, tugged at the hem of his vest, and walked toward Danielle like he owned every inch of the path. Between them, his boots sank slightly into the earth where the grass thinned, crushing dry twigs with a sound that felt louder in the stillness. Danielle didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't blink, just watched quietly, measuring everything about the man approaching her. She noticed the small things first, because that's what training taught her, the tension in his jaw, the shallow but quickened breaths, the slight flex of his right thumb toward the radio button he hadn't pressed yet. His nameplate gleamed faintly in the light. Hale, when he stopped, just short of her personal space, he looked at her like she was furniture, placed in the wrong room. Out for a jog, huh? He asked, voice dry, words clipped, like he didn't care for an answer so much as how she gave it. Danielle nodded once. Yes. He looked her up and down in a slow, unapologetic scan, eyes hidden behind mirrored lenses, but his meaning clear. You live around here. Danielle felt the shift in temperature, not in the air, but in the dynamic. This wasn't a check-in, it was a test. He wanted to provoke something, maybe fear, maybe defensiveness, maybe guilt that didn't exist. She kept her tone even, just running. That answer didn't satisfy him, not because it was vague, but because it came without the usual submission. He took a half step closer, angling himself just enough to make her notice, not enough to seem hostile if anyone was watching, but enough for her to know the space between them was no longer neutral. We've had a few calls lately, he said, glancing down the path, then back to her. Reports of suspicious activity, people who don't quite fit in. Danielle didn't need to ask what that meant. She'd lived long enough, worn enough uniforms, carried enough authority to know when words weren't about what was said, but what wasn't. I haven't seen anything suspicious, she replied calmly. His lips pressed into a line, neither frown nor smile, just pressure. He reached up, slid his sunglasses to the top of his head, revealing eyes that weren't angry, but agitated, like someone stuck behind a door they expected to be open. What's your name? He asked. Danielle tilted her head slightly. Am I being detained? He let out a short laugh that didn't belong to humor. So, you're one of those, huh? He said, folding his arms. Knows her right. Maybe studied a little law on the side. Danielle didn't answer. Her silence wasn't defiance, it was precision. Every word now carried weight, and she wasn't about to waste any on his performance. Instead, she stood still, feet grounded, not threatening, but unshakable. And that unnerved him more than raised voices ever could. His next words came sharper. I'm gonna need to see some ID, or at least something that proves you're not just passing through here for the wrong reasons. Danielle's pulse didn't spike. She'd been in colder interrogation rooms, stood in the ruins of Sava, farms targeted by foreign states, and still found clarity when others drowned in panic. This was just a man trying to pick a fight because he hadn't been taught how to handle a woman who refused to flinch. "I'm not required to present ID unless you have cause," she said. "And jogging in a public park isn't cause." That made him shift, just barely a twitch in the jaw, a recalibration. He wasn't used to resistance that didn't look like defiance. She wasn't raising her voice, wasn't reaching for her phone, wasn't making a scene, and somehow, that made her more dangerous to him than someone who would. He looked over her shoulder briefly, as if checking for an audience. A car passed, in the distance, but didn't stop. The other joggers were gone now. The trail was quiet. Danielle felt the isolation stretch around her like a circle being drawn. "You think this is a game?" he asked, stepping in again, voice lower now. "You think I won't detain you right here?" Danielle took a slow, deep breath, not to calm herself, but to give herself space to choose her next move. "No," she said quietly. "I think you've already decided what I am, and that's more dangerous than anything I'm doing." He froze, not physically, but mentally. That response didn't fit the script. It didn't give him the foothold he wanted. He opened his mouth to reply but didn't speak. Instead, he looked down at her hands, empty, unthreatening, then back to her face. She didn't avert her eyes. The wind stirred again, rustling the trees gently. A bird flitted from one branch to another, its wings soft against the air. And in that moment, Danielle felt the world tightening, not because of him alone, but because of the system he carried like a badge heavier than his own. He wasn't just a man, he was a structure, a set of assumptions, an entire machinery trained to see her body before her humanity. Still, she didn't back down, because somewhere deep inside, beyond protocol, beyond years of quiet compliance and small unrecorded humiliations, Danielle had made a choice long ago, a quiet, steady vow. When the world came for her, not as a citizen but as a target, she would not retreat, she would stand, even if she stood alone. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't reach for his cuffs, but there was something in the way Officer Hale shifted his stance, a subtle widening of his legs, one hand resting too naturally near his belt, that told Danielle this wasn't about law enforcement anymore. It was about control, about a man refusing to be ignored by someone he expected to cower. The space between them narrowed not with movement, but with pressure, the kind of silent tension that tightens the air without a sound. The birds had quieted now, or maybe it only seemed that way because her senses had sharpened into that rare focus that came from years in the field, when you didn't yet have proof something was wrong, but you felt the wrongness in your bones. Danielle didn't move, didn't speak, just let her breath settle into her chest like a low tide. She could smell the iron in the air, faint but rising, as if her body already knew what might come. The officer cleared his throat once, then asked again, "You carrying anything? Phone, wallet, ID?" This time, his tone was flatter, practiced, like he'd entered the part of the script that sounded procedural but was anything but neutral. "I have my phone," Danielle said softly, her voice a deliberate blend of calm and clarity. "It's in my side pocket. You mind showing it?" he asked. But the way he said it left little room for choice. Danielle didn't move yet. "Am I suspected of a crime?" He smirked it with humor, but with irritation dressed as amusement. "You're in a neighborhood with recent break-ins," he said, glancing around like he was trying to summon backup that wasn't coming. "That's enough to ask some questions." "That's not enough to search me," she replied. The firmness in her voice wasn't aggression, it was structure, like steel wrapped in velvet. She saw him flinch slightly, not in his face, but in his eyes, which blinked a fraction too quickly. He wasn't used to this kind of resistance, not from someone like her, especially not here. He stepped back half a foot and laughed, dry and sharp. "Lady, you got an answer for everything, huh?" he muttered. "Let me guess, graduate of some Ivy, huh? Knows the Constitution better than me." "I know enough to know I haven't broken the law," she said. "Depends who you ask," he snapped back. Danielle saw it then, the shift, not just in his posture, but in the temperature behind his eyes. He was no longer trying to assess a situation, he was trying to reclaim power he thought should have been his from the start, and she wasn't giving it to him. That made her a problem. She considered showing her badge, ending it now. But something in her said not yet. She'd seen what happened when people led with authority rather than dignity, how it distorted the moment, made it about rank instead of principle. If she showed it now, he'd step back out of fear, not understanding. And fear, unlike understanding, didn't change a man. He moved again, circling her slightly, as if trying to find an angle, something out of place. "You know what I think," he said suddenly. "I think you're stalling. I think you're here casing the place, and you didn't expect anyone to call you on it." She turned her head slowly until her eyes met his. "You can think whatever you want," she said, "but your thoughts aren't grounds for detainment." He stopped, then just stopped, like the ground under his boots had shifted an inch and he wasn't sure it would hold. Danielle knew this moment well, the moment when a man like Hale decided whether to double down or let go. Too often, they didn't let go. His jaw tightened. "Turn around," he said. "For what?" Danielle asked, her voice lower now, almost sad. "I'm checking for weapons. Do you have cause? You're refusing a lawful request." "I'm refusing an unlawful one," she replied. They stood like that. Two people 30 inches apart but separated by two very different versions of what power was supposed to look like. The breeze moved the trees gently overhead. A squirrel darted across the path. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. But here, in this sliver of space, time had folded into a stillness that made every second heavier than the one before. Then, without warning, he reached for his radio but didn't press the button. Danielle took one step back. "Don't move," he said quickly. "I'm not threatening you," she replied, hands visible, still at her sides. "I'm just maintaining space." "Stop talking like that," he snapped. "Like what?" she asked. "Like you're above this," he said. And there it was, not accusation, not procedure, just raw discomfort with the fact that she wouldn't shrink. Danielle stared at him for a long second, the corners of her mouth still, her hands steady. She thought of the number of people who'd been in her position but hadn't known their rights. Thought of the people who'd been compliant and still didn't make it home. Thought of the ones who'd been told later that the video wasn't conclusive, that the angle wasn't clear, that the story didn't quite fit the narrative. And in that space between silence and speech, she realized something with icy certainty. This wasn't about suspicion anymore. It was about ego. His and hers had no place in this conversation. She nodded once, slow, like someone turning a mental page. "I'm going to reach for my phone," she said, "with my right hand. No sudden moves." "You're recording me," he said, eyes narrowing. "No," she replied, "but maybe I should." She didn't wait for permission. She reached, slowly, deliberately, and drew the phone from her pocket like it was a relic, not a tool. She raised it chest high, didn't say a word, and pressed record. He didn't like that. She saw it in the way his hand twitched again near the radio, but he didn't stop her, not yet. The lens pointed at him like a mirror, and some men, when faced with a reflection, see themselves clearer. Others just get angrier. She lifted the phone with steady fingers, her wrist level with her chest, elbow slightly bent. Camera aimed forward, not to provoke, not to escalate, but to preserve. In that moment, it wasn't a weapon or a shield. It was a witness, silent and impartial, blinking its single eye at the man who now felt his stage shrinking. Officer Hale's jaw tensed as he registered the lens, his pupils darting from her hand to her eyes, then briefly toward the trail behind them, scanning for an audience he couldn't see but suddenly feared might be watching. The birds had resumed their quiet songs, a low rhythm in the trees above, but around the two of them, the world seemed to still, as if waiting to see who would cross the line first. Danielle didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her body was a language of its own, spine straight, expression unreadable, breath even. It was the kind of stillness you learn when you've seen too many people make the wrong move under pressure. The kind of stillness that isn't submission, but control. Hale, on the other hand, shifted from one foot to the other, like the earth had turned soft beneath him. His right hand hung too close to his holster, his fingers twitching in nervous half-curls, a silent metronome counting the beats of his unraveling authority. "You're recording me now?" he asked, voice tight-edged with a false calm that cracked at the corners. "I'm recording this moment," Danielle replied, her tone neutral, her eyes holding his butt, never daring. His lips curled slightly, like he wanted to laugh but couldn't find the nerve. "You think that phone's gonna protect you?" Danielle didn't blink. "I think it might protect you," she said, and the sentence landed like a flat stone across still water, quiet, but undeniable in its weight. That's when something in him snapped. Maybe it was the way she stood firm without threat. Maybe it was the lack of fear in her voice. Or maybe it was just the accumulation of 1,000 small frustrations from a man used to compliance, now facing someone who simply refused to shrink. Either way, his next movement didn't feel like policy. It felt like impulse dressed up in authority. Without a single word of warning, he lunged forward and swung his boot into her wrist with a force that surprised even him. The impact was sharp, immediate, brutal in its precision. Her phone flew from her hand in a high arc, spinning mid-air like a stone skipping through gravity before slamming into the paved edge of the trail. The crack of glass meeting concrete echoed louder than the birdsong. The device landed face down, a spiderweb of fractures spreading across the screen, pixels flickering once before dying into silence. Danielle stumbled half a step back, from pain, but from the shock of contact, because no part of her had expected him to go physical without pretense. Her fingers flexed slightly, her forearm tingled, but she didn't cry out, didn't retreat. She stood there, wrist stinging, mind cold. A man jogging in the distance slowed, pulling one earbud out, his steps hesitating. An elderly woman walking a dog stopped and turned, eyes widening, mouth silent. Around them, the air thickened with something heavier than humidity, a realization that something had broken, and not just the glass on the ground. "You just assaulted me," Danielle said, her voice low and even. "You resisted an officer's order," Hale barked, pointing at her with a trembling hand. "No," she answered, gaze narrowing slightly. "I resisted being bullied. There's a difference." He took a step closer again, voice rising. "Now, I told you to cooperate. You kicked my wrist," she said, more to the world than to him, and you did it in public. "You're under investigation," he stammered. "Obstruction, interference." But he didn't finish, because something in her posture had changed. Not dramatic, not aggressive, just different. She had tilted slightly sideways, her right knee softening, her shoulders lowering, as if drawing energy downward. It wasn't threatening, it was centered. And Hale, despite the vest, the badge, the years of field conditioning, suddenly looked like a man facing something he didn't recognize. Danielle didn't wait for his next word. Her right hand reached down, not to strike, not to flee, but to reposition. In one smooth motion, she pivoted her hips, brought her right foot slightly forward, and with surgical grace, let her left arm hook behind his knee, not to trip him, hard not to injure, but just enough to disrupt his balance. Her body moved like water, not muscle, not rage. He stumbled forward, arms flailing as gravity took hold. His left knee struck the ground with a dull thud, elbow scraping dirt, chin jolting forward before he caught himself. But it was too late. His posture had collapsed. His authority had followed. He lay there, half on one side, breathing hard, palms planted on the grass like a man trying to reconnect with solid ground. The jogger stood frozen. The woman with the dog had pulled out her phone, already recording. The silence around them was no longer bystander apathy, it was bearing witness. Danielle stepped forward slowly, calmly, and reached behind her waistband. She didn't rush, she didn't smirk. She simply withdrew a small leather wallet, opened it with one hand, and held it where he could see. The golden badge caught the morning sun and flashed once. Federal Bureau of Investigation, embossed and real. Hale looked up, eyes wide, pupils dilated, breath caught halfway between denial and disbelief. "You," he began, then stopped. Danielle didn't raise her voice. She didn't move an inch closer. She just said, with the same calm that had carried her through hostage negotiations, counterintelligence, interrogations, and midnight raids, "Do you know who you just kicked?" The question wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation to face the truth he'd tried to outrun. She watched him freeze, not out of fear, but because a part of him finally understood he'd miscalculated something far more dangerous than rank. He'd underestimated a woman trained not to flinch in the face of violence, who knew the law better than he knew his own badge number, and who refused to let injustice walk away quietly. And in that still moment, with his knee in the dirt and the world suddenly watching, Officer Brian Hale wasn't a cop anymore. He was a man with a decision to make, and no more room left to hide. For a moment, no one moved, not Danielle, not Hale, not the handful of bystanders who'd silently gathered within eyesight, like shadows drawn to a shifting wind. The park, which just minutes ago had held the soft rhythm of a peaceful morning, now carried a tension so thick it seemed to hum beneath the grass. Hale remained kneeling awkwardly on one knee, hands pressed into the earth, like someone anchoring himself to a reality he hadn't prepared for. His mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but whatever sentence formed in his mind dissolved the instant his eyes met the badge in Danielle's hand. It gleamed under the filtered sunlight, not polished for show, but worn from years of use. Its weight was more than symbolic, its authority undeniable. Danielle didn't lower the badge, didn't press forward, didn't speak again. She just stood there, one hand holding truth, the other resting at her side, steady as ever. It wasn't about spectacle or dominance. It was about forcing her man, everyone watching, to sit with what had just happened. Her breath was measured, not from adrenaline, but from the muscle memory of discipline, from years of knowing restraint often said more than confrontation ever could. The ache in her wrist from his kicks still throbbed, a sharp pulse from palm to elbow, but she didn't flinch or favor it. The pain was there, Yes, but so was her control. The man in jogging shoes took a tentative step forward, holding his phone at chest level, not hiding that he was recording. He didn't say a word, but the slight tension in his brow showed he knew exactly what kind of story was unfolding. The woman with the dog had moved farther down the path, her camera still trained on the scene, her dog sitting obediently beside her. Like it's understood something serious was happening, a child's voice called faintly in the distance, "Mom, is that a real agent?" But no response followed. Only the low rustle of wind against leaves and the distant hum of morning traffic beyond the tree line reminded everyone the world hadn't completely stopped. Hale finally spoke, though his voice came out smaller than before, touched with something unfamiliar certainty. This isn't what it looks like," he muttered, as though words could roll back what had occurred. Danielle looked at him, calm and direct. "It looks exactly like what it is," she said. "And now it's recorded twice." That line landed like a quiet gavel, not theatrical, not cruel, just final. Hale blinked slowly, rising to his feet, brushing grass from his knees, in a motion that looked more like habit than purpose. His hands hovered awkwardly at his sides, unsure where to land. He looked smaller now, not physically, but in presence. The bravado that had filled his chest when he first stepped out of that cruiser had evaporated, leaving a man exposed not by force, but by the clarity of consequence. He tried to speak again, maybe to offer an apology or explanation, but nothing came. His voice, like his posture, had lost its authority. Danielle lowered her badge, but didn't holster it yet. She let it remain in her fingers, as if to say this moment wasn't over. Her silence wasn't passive, it was pointed. It demanded reflection. She watched his eyes flick toward the phone, still lying broken on the trail. Tiny fragments of glass glittered around it like ice. She followed his gaze, then slowly walked toward it. Her steps were even, deliberate, each one a small declaration that she wouldn't be rattled by his violence. She crouched, picked up the phone with her left hand, her injured one, and examined it. The screen was shattered beyond use, but the camera lens looked intact. She didn't check the recording, she didn't need to. She knew someone else had caught everything from another angle, and maybe that was enough. Maybe, this time, the truth wouldn't be a matter of hearsay or internal memos quietly shelved. As she stood, her eyes caught movement in the background, a young woman with a backpack stepping off her bicycle, phone already raised, filming in silence. Danielle offered no smile, no nod of acknowledgement, just presence, just truth in motion. "I need your badge number," she said, turning back to Hale. His lips parted, hesitant. "Why?" She didn't repeat herself. He looked down, as if the number might be written on the ground, then exhaled and recited it, voice flat, mechanical. She nodded once, committed it to memory, and said nothing more. "You gonna make this a thing?" he asked, a flicker of his old arrogance returning, though it sounded weak, like it had lost conviction. Danielle looked at him, steady. "You already did." There was nothing else to add, no argument worth having. The crowd, grown by quiet increments, now watched in stillness, their phones like small spotlights trained on what justice sometimes looked like, not courtroom speeches or grand takedowns, but a quiet reckoning beneath old trees in a park never meant to hold this kind of history. She turned and walked away, not quickly, not defiantly, just with the sure-footed calm that couldn't be faked. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her exit wasn't retreat, it was resolve. And behind her, Officer Hale stood alone, caught not in handcuffs, not in hand-to-hand defeat, but in the undeniable truth of his own exposure. And maybe, for the first time in his career, he understood what it meant to be seen, not obeyed, not feared, just seen. And sometimes, that's the one thing a man like him fears most. By mid-afternoon, the video had begun its quiet migration from private phones to public platforms. Each upload was like a stone tossed into a still pond, sending ripples into spaces Danielle never intended to reach. It didn't start with a headline or a trending tag, just a shaky 43-second clip, captured by a woman on her morning walk, uploaded without a caption, shared with only a handful of friends. In the video, Hale's boot made sudden contact with Danielle's wrist, her phone cracked against the pavement, and then, in the next breath, she pivoted, dropped him to the ground with graceful efficiency, and held up the badge like a mirror he couldn't avoid. The moment didn't need narration. The silence in the footage spoke louder than any voiceover could. Danielle didn't post it. She didn't even know it was out there yet. After leaving the park, she'd gone straight home, fingers still aching, shirt slightly damped from the humid air and her own restraint. She didn't sit for a long time, just stood by the kitchen counter with the window cracked, letting the wind stir the hem of her shirt while her mind replayed every second, not as memory, but as evidence. She knew what had happened, knew how it would be questioned, how it would be framed, how some would say she must have done something, anything to deserve being kicked. That's how it always began. What did she do to provoke it? But this time, the cameras hadn't blinked. Her replacement phone buzzed quietly on the counter, not a loud notification, just a soft pulse of connection. She tapped the screen and saw the first message, a link, no words, then another, and another. Within minutes she realized the moment was no longer hers. It had been absorbed by the public, reshaped into a symbol she hadn't consented to become. She pressed play, watched, herself in third person, detached, composed, precise, watched hail fall, watched the badge rise, the crowd's hush, the weight of realization. The line, "Do you know who you just kicked?" She hadn't remembered how clear her voice sounded, how low and final. Watching it now, she didn't feel pride. She felt a tightening in her chest, like something permanent had shifted without her permission. The next link came with a caption, "FBI agent flips cop after assault, and she does it without saying a word." Danielle winced, then sighed. This wasn't going away, not soon, not cleanly. By the time the evening news picked it up, the footage had been reposted thousands of times, stitched into TikToks, dissected by YouTube commentators, broadcast on local channels with slow-motion replays. Some outlets blurred her badge, others didn't. Some framed her as a hero, a calm face of justice. Others focused on the aggression of the takedown, raising questions about appropriate use of sex. But none asked how it felt to be a woman standing still while the system lunged first. Danielle turned off the television before they could spin it further. She didn't need to hear what they thought she meant. She'd lived long enough to know what happens when strangers decide to tell your story for you. The following morning she walked into the bureau, quietly arriving before most colleagues. No press outside yet, no questions, just the usual hum of fluorescent lights and the faint click of keys echoing from another floor. Her badge scanned green. The lobby doors opened like any other day, but she knew the atmosphere had changed, it because anyone said anything, but because no one did. One agent passed her in the hall without eye contact. Another nodded a little too quickly before disappearing around a corner. At her desk, a cup of coffee waited black, just how she liked it, but no note, no name. She sat and stared at it for a long moment before taking a sip, letting the warmth ground her. Her supervisor appeared in her doorway half an hour later. He didn't speak immediately, just leaned against the frame, arms crossed, face unreadable. Then he said, "Hell of a morning jog." Danielle didn't smile. "You saw it. Everyone has," he said, including the director. Nodded once, exhaling through her nose. "I didn't plan for this." "I know," he replied. "But the world doesn't care what we plan, it just records." He left it at that, didn't stay long, didn't ask for a report, at least not yet. And that, more than anything, told her what she already knew. The institution wasn't ready to speak on it, not until it saw how the public responded. Her inbox lit up slowly throughout the day. A few messages from fellow agents, short, vague words of support that never directly referenced what happened. One simply read, "Respect, quiet but strong." Another said, "They picked the wrong woman." But most emails weren't from the bureau, or they were from strangers, teachers, veterans, grandmothers, law students. Messages from across the country, from people who saw in her something they wished they could be. Some thanked her for standing up. Others admitted they didn't know how to feel, only that the moment made them stop and think in a way they hadn't before. But there were darker messages, too, threats veiled as questions, accusations of abusing power, calling her a traitor, a puppet, a danger, the flip side of attention. And Danielle knew, deep down, this was only the beginning. By dusk, the park had become a landmark. People took selfies near the trail where she'd stood. Someone placed a handwritten sign on a nearby tree that read, "This is where silence ended." It was both flattering and exhausting. Danielle sat on her porch that night, watching the last light settle into the hills. The stars hadn't come out yet, but the cicadas had begun their song, a low hum of persistence and memory. She sipped tea with her left hand, her right wrist still sore, wrapped lightly in an ice pack. She didn't regret what she'd done, not for a second. But she knew what came next wouldn't be about healing. It would be about visibility and the cost of it. By the time the sun edged over the horizon the next morning, Danielle was at her desk, back straight, eyes focused, fingers hovering above her keyboard like they were waiting for her body to catch up with her mind. The office was still quiet, humming with the low ambient sounds of HVAC vents and distant copier trays. She liked it this way, early, undisturbed, when the building felt more like a library than a bureaucracy. But today, that stillness didn't offer calm. It brought a clarity she couldn't ignore. The incident in the park had cracked something, open not just publicly, but inside her, a door she'd always known was there but never fully walked through. And now, with the world watching, she knew there was only one direction left, deeper. She signed into the internal database slowly, her fingers moving with the same deliberate pace she used for classified materials measured.com. Exact. Clearance hadn't changed, but her intent had. She wasn't here on assignment. No one had asked her to dig. But that didn't matter anymore. What happened with Hale wasn't an isolated outburst or a moment of bad judgment. It was a pattern, a symptom of something far more entrenched. She'd felt it in his voice, his posture, the way he reached for authority like a weapon instead of a responsibility. She opened the complaints index first, typing his name with quiet precision. Hale, Brian, E. The screen blinked once, then loaded a string of cases, each marked with gray-coded statuses, like closed, unfounded, or administrative review. None had been flagged for escalation. None had resulted in suspension. She clicked through each one, eyes narrowing, jaw tightening with every vague phrase and redacted name. The language was clinical, stripped of urgency, excessive force alleged, no supporting documentation, verbal confrontation reported, no audio recording recovered, subject unable to be contacted for follow-up. Each report felt like a ghost present but invisible in practice. Then she saw it, case number FC1132, dated 7 years back, flagged from a precinct in upstate New York, where Hale had served before transferring. The name jumped out before she registered why. Jamal Edwards, age 17. The incident summary was barely 2 paragraphs. Subject sustained minor injuries during detainment after verbal resistance. No body cam available. Officer Hale confirmed proper use of force protocol. The medical report listed a concussion and a gash over the boy's right eye requiring 5 stitches. No formal complaint had been filed by the family. The last line, read, matter resolved, with no further action. Danielle leaned back slowly, her hand resting lightly against her lips. The room suddenly felt colder. She remembered that name not from media headlines or public outrage. There hadn't been any because, during her time on the Bureau's Civil Rights Task Force, that file had briefly landed on her desk as part of a low-priority aggregate scan. She'd marked it with a red tag, noted it for follow-up, but the note had disappeared. The tag had been removed, and now, 7 years later, she understood why. She clicked deeper into the report's metadata, tracing the chain of edits. The case had been reviewed 3 times, twice by Internal Affairs, once by a senior DOJ liaison, but Hale's name had never appeared in external report logs. His presence was visible only in back-end annotations, buried beneath layers of technical bureaucracy. Someone had kept his name just out of sight, low enough to avoid triggering anything but the faintest radar blip. She stood abruptly, the chair sliding back with a low screech against the floor. The office was still quiet, but now that quiet felt different, thicker, heavier, like it was pressing back. She crossed to the secure printer, waiting as it churned out the file she'd requested. As the pages slid out, she noticed her hands weren't shaking, not from anger, not from fear. What she felt was colder, sharper sense of purpose, so focused it left no room for doubt. Back at her desk, she laid the pages out. The photo of Jamal was grainy, scanned from an old intake form, but the wound above his eye was unmistakable, even through the distortion. She traced her fingers lightly over the report's edges, as if touching it might bring him into the room, let him know someone hadn't forgotten. Then she opened a secondary database, witness tracking. She typed the name from the supplemental notes, Devonte Mills, listed as a neighbor who'd seen the altercation. The file came up half-formed, marked unavailable for contact. The summary claimed field agents had attempted to visits with no response, but Danielle noticed a detail tucked at the bottom, a handwritten notation. Faint in faded black ink. Witness reluctant, not uncooperative, possibly intimidated. No follow-up recorded. No report on why. She whispered under her breath. They buried it. Not loudly, not accusing, just truth laid bare. The questions stacked quickly, more like pressure points than curiosities. Who filed the original report? Why was Hale's name redacted? Who signed off on closing the file? She scanned the reviewer list. One name appeared on 3 separate pages. R. Finn. It was a name she hadn't heard in years, but it rang a distant bell. Oh, Robert Finn, a former supervisory liaison between state police and federal oversight, known for his talent in internal alignment. That was the term they used. Lineman. It sounded tidy, even noble. But Danielle remembered what it meant. Smoothing corners, making inconvenient truths fit digestible narratives. She didn't print that file. Not yet. Instead, she saved it to a secure external drive, locked it in her drawer, and logged the access as review for reclassification audit. It wasn't a lie, not technically, but she knew what she was doing. She sat back and stared out the small, reinforced window of her office. The sky had shifted from soft blue to overcast, clouds heavy with something that hadn't fallen yet. The wind outside pushed faint shadows across the parking lot. She watched a leaf get caught in a gust rise, then vanish from view. Inside her, something had risen to not rage, not grief, but memory sharpened into intention. Danielle knew now that what happened in that park wasn't just about her. It was about every file, like Jamal's, every witness who stopped answering the door, every complaint that faded under the weight of silence. And if she didn't follow the trail now, if she didn't drag these names back into the light, no one would. The following days passed with the rhythm of a clock ticking behind, a closed door, steady, quiet, but growing louder the more you listened. Danielle worked alone, not because she was hiding, but because she needed space to breathe through the weight of what she was uncovering. The deeper she went into the archives, the more familiar names reappeared, names from old cases, internal inquiries that had quietly vanished from meetings where people spoke in careful language, disguising inaction as discretion. Patterns emerged not just in the files, but in the hands that handled them. Names signed at the bottom of review memos, initials buried in revision histories, subtle but consistent fingerprints of someone who'd shaped narratives to protect reputations, not people. Robert Finn's name came up more than any other, never as the center, never as the direct actor, but always in the margins, advisory notes, closure summaries, emails recommending strategic reframing, sign-offs for policy drafts that rewarded accountability into something less measurable. Danielle remembered him vaguely from years back, a man in tailored suits with a voice that never rose above a whisper but always carried finality. He'd worked as a liaison between federal oversight and state enforcement boards, floating just beneath the surface of policy where real decisions often got made without leaving fingerprints. She traced his involvement to at least 9 cases, linked to excessive force, each marked by the same trajectory: initial complaint, delay, internal reroute, closure due to insufficient basis for action. Each file had a familiar chill, like doors cracked open but shut before anyone could step through. One case involved a young woman, Kayla Vasquez, arrested for trespassing outside a gas station she'd worked at the week before. Her complaint mentioned an officer unnamed in the final report who used force that left bruises across her collarbone. The officer was never identified, and the footage was declared lost in transfer. Danielle cross-referenced the precinct and dates. Brian Hale had been on rotation in that district at the time. The connection wasn't definitive, but it didn't need to be. The pattern itself was damning that she leaned back in her chair, fluorescent lights casting pale shadows across her desk, her eyes scanning the names again. Jamal Edwards, Kayla Vasquez, Elias Reading. Different cities, different years, but the same echo in every record. Someone tried to speak, and someone more powerful ensured they wouldn't be heard. And behind them, always just off to the side, was Finn. Danielle turned to the window, watching her reflection blur against the darkened glass. Outside, the parking lot was nearly empty, the sky overcast, clouds heavy with an impending storm that hadn't yet decided whether to fall. Her reflection looked tired, not from lack of sleep, but from the soul-deep fatigue of realizing how many stories were never told, because someone with a polished smile and an executive title deemed them too inconvenient. She picked up her phone and called an old DOJ contact, Patrice, who'd once shared office space with her during a cross-agency task force. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered, warm but cautious. "You don't usually call without a reason." Danielle didn't waste time. "What do you remember about Finn?" There was a pause, the kind that makes you wonder if someone's deciding whether to lie. Then Patrice sighed. "Depends which version you want, the public one or the one people only whisper when the doors are shut." Danielle exhaled slowly. "You already know which one I'm calling for." Another pause. "He knew how to make things disappear," Patrice said. "Never illegally, just quietly. A meeting here, a note there. A suggestion that maybe this isn't worth the noise. He never got his hands dirty." But things stopped moving when he said they should. Danielle felt that chill again, not from fear, but from recognition. The kind that comes when a theory solidifies into something more than suspicion. "Did you ever see him shield anyone directly?" she asked. "No names," Patrice replied, but he once pulled me aside and told me pushing too hard on a misconduct case could destabilize a valuable relationship with a respected agency partner. His words, I knew exactly who he meant. Danielle didn't reply right away. The silence wasn't doubted, was confirmation. She thanked Patrice, promised to follow up, and hung up without saying goodbye. The moment didn't need ceremony. That night, she printed every file connected to Finn's signature, 22 in total. She laid them across her apartment floor, pages overlapping like fallen leaves, each carrying the scent of neglect, the quiet residue of power misused through omission. She didn't light candles or play music. She just sat among them, cross-legged, scanning each line, each code, each sentence crafted to sound objective but stripped of justice. And as she moved through those pages, she realized something that made her shoulders sink, not from defeat, but from understanding. This wasn't about one officer losing control or one agent demanding accountability. This was about a structure designed not to protect abuse, but to ignore it until it faded from view. It was a culture of convenience, not conspiracy, one where people like Finn weren't evil, just expertly detached. But that detachment had a cost, and it lived in the silence of people whose names were reduced to incident numbers, who never got a second line in the report. Danielle stood slowly, knees stiff, spine aching, but focus sharpened. She gathered the papers, sorted them into folders labeled by case and region. Tomorrow she would send copies to oversight officers she trusted, to legal partners who wouldn't flinch, to journalists who still believed in telling stories that made people uncomfortable, because now she knew this wasn't about closing the book on Hale, it was about opening the file on everyone who taught him how to get away with it. The threats didn't come all at once. They arrived in fragments, in the empty spaces where silence used to live. A flyer tucked under her windshield wiper at the grocery store, printed on cheap paper, ink slightly smudged, but the words bold and scented. We see what you're doing. Stop while you still can. It wasn't signed. No return address, no symbol, no logo, just that unmistakable tone of warning wrapped in politeness. The kind that didn't need to shout to be menacing. Danielle stared at it in the parking lot for a full minute before folding it neatly, slipping it into her coat pocket, and driving away without turning on the radio. At home, the air was still. She didn't close the curtains or double-check the locks, not because she wasn't cautious, but because she'd already memorized every shadow in her apartment. The quiet didn't comfort her anymore, not like it used to. Now it felt thick, expectant, like something waiting just beyond the room's edge. She moved through the space with measured grace, the kind you carry when you know every step might echo in ears you can't see. Her computer was still warm from the last round of research, case files open, names highlighted, screenshots printed and sorted into stacks lining her kitchen table like a silent audience. She didn't tell anyone about the flyer, not yet. There was no point. It wasn't enough to report, not enough to trigger action. And besides, she knew the response. Are you sure it wasn't just someone venting? Do you have proof they meant harm? It was always the same script. That burden of clarity always fell on the person already under pressure. And Danielle wasn't about to ask for protection from a system she was trying to expose. A few days later, she noticed a black sedan parked across the street from her building. Not unusual on its own, but it hadn't moved for 2 nights straight. The windows were too dark to see inside. The engine never ran. It didn't trigger motion lights. It just sat there, still and unblinking, like an eye that didn't need to blink. She didn't confront it, didn't stare too long, but she began changing her routine, slightly leaving out the side exit, taking different streets, swapping coffee shops each morning, like changing passwords. It wasn't paranoia, it was protocol, and she followed it without resentment. Only the quiet discipline of someone trained for threats that didn't carry names. That evening, her work phone buzzed with a restricted call. She let it ring twice before answering, her voice firm but level. Agent Porter. A pause, then a voice mid-40s by the sound, careful in tone but strangely soft. Just a friendly reminder, he said. Some files were never meant to be reopened, not because they're wrong, but because there's no one left to fix them. Danielle didn't reply. She let the silence expand between them like a hallway with no end, then hung up without a word. Her hand didn't shake, her breath didn't change, but her eyes lingered on the window, watching the sedan's still silhouette dissolve into the darkness. She knew what this was, not just a warning, but a message, carefully timed. The voice hadn't mentioned names, it didn't need to. It was about letting her know someone was watching the edges of her movement, someone with access to corners of the system that should have been sealed. And that meant she was getting closer than they were comfortable with. The next morning, she filed a sealed memo documenting the call, the flyer, and the car, addressed not to internal affairs but to an independent counsel she'd worked with years ago on a corruption audit. The subject line was short, activity consistent with non-official intimidation. She didn't expect a reply, she just needed it on record, because if anything happened next, she wouldn't be the only one who knew. She also printed duplicates of her notes on the Finn connection, 3 sets, sealed and mailed to 3 trusted colleagues in 3 different cities, none of whom worked for the government anymore. Each package included a cover letter. If you receive this, something's been interrupted. Forward contents to press. It wasn't melodrama, it was contingency. Danielle wasn't afraid of confrontation, she was afraid of being silenced before the story was complete. Later that afternoon, she stood at the window, sipping coffee slowly, watching the sedan. It was gone now. Disappeared sometime between sunrise and noon. The absence should have felt like relief, but it didn't. It felt like a trap reset. She scanned the block, nothing out of place. Children walking home from school, a delivery truck rumbling past, someone walking a golden retriever with a lazy gait. Everything looked normal, but she'd learned long ago that normal was just a costume Danger liked to wear before stepping forward. That evening, a new message came handwritten, tucked into her building's mail slot. The paper was heavier, the ink darker, almost deliberate in its careful strokes. There are ways to make noise disappear. Ask yourself if it's worth it. She stared at it under the hallway light for a while, then folded it once and tucked it into the same file as the flyer. There was no fear in her chest, just a rising clarity that this was no longer about evidence. It was about pressure, about whether she would fold or keep moving. She walked back to her apartment slowly, keys in hand, eyes scanning reflexively. Inside, she locked the door, turned off the lights, and sat on the floor by her desk, cross-legged, surrounded by documents that felt less like paper and more like memory clawed back from erasure's edge. She wasn't in danger because she'd made a mistake. She was in danger because she'd chosen not to look away. Danielle didn't decide to file the suit out of impulse, vengeance, or anger. That was never her style. She waited, measured the ground beneath her, studied the weight of each document she'd compiled, and moved forward only when she knew there were no more back doors to close. By the time she walked into the federal courthouse with a worn leather folder under her arm, and her attorney at her side, the story had grown beyond her control. But the act of filing, of putting her name on a legal motion challenging not just an officer but a system, was hers alone. The morning was overcast, quiet, oddly still, as if the sky itself held its breath. Inside the lobby, everything felt colder than usual, the marble floor echoing her steps with unnecessary clarity. Her attorney, Rena, from an independent justice initiative, kept conversation minimal, speaking only to confirm technical points. Danielle appreciated it. She didn't want to talk this morning. Her silence wasn't nerves, it was focus. Her spine was straight, hands steady, but her eyes carried the calm of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, even if it meant walking into fire. The clerk glanced at the paperwork without ceremony, checked the timestamp, and slid it into the system with a practiced click. And just like that, it was official. Danielle Porter versus City Department, Officer Brian Hale, and related entities. The phrase felt clinical on paper, almost too clean for what it meant. But that's how truth moved in the early stages, quietly, like a fuse laid under dry soil. As they stepped outside, the wind picked up, brushing Danielle's coat against her legs. The courthouse steps were mostly empty, save for a local reporter snapping photos from a respectful distance and a law student scribbling notes on a clipboard, as if history might pass him by if he blinked. Rena turned to her. Sure you're ready for this part? Danielle nodded once. I've been ready for a long time. That evening, the news broke not as a scandal, but as a headline sharper than most. FBI agent files suit alleging pattern of police abuse and internal obstruction. The word pattern stood out, bolded, repeated across digital feeds. It wasn't just about the park, it was about the names she'd found, the stories buried under years of administrative dust, the paper trail pointing not to one man but to a culture that quietly kept him in power. The response was immediate. Civil rights groups reposted the story within minutes. Old colleagues she hadn't spoken to in years sent quiet supportsome one-line emails, others longer, confessing moments they regretted staying silent, files they were told not to review, questions they never finished asking. One simply said, "We failed her. I hope you don't." But not everyone was supportive. That night her phone buzzed with new threats, couched in vague legalese or hidden in anonymous accounts. One read, You just made yourself a bigger target. Congratulations. Another said, there are places we still control. Danielle didn't delete them, she archived every one, labeled by date, IP, and phrasing, and forwarded them to the proper authorities, not because she believed they'd act swiftly, but because paper mattered, even when people didn't. Inside her apartment, the atmosphere had changed. The stillness now felt like tension, not peace. Like every shadow on the wall was a presence needing watching. She adjusted her routines against changed passwords, rerouted emails through a secure node, locked her phone in a Faraday pouch each night. These weren't signs of fear, they were reminders that even truth had to be protected from hands that wanted to twist it. Her attorney called the next morning. The city requested a meeting. Danielle arched an eyebrow. To talk or to intimidate? Rena chuckled dryly. Little bit of both, I imagine. They scheduled it anyway. She wasn't going to run from a conversation, not even one dressed as civility. The meeting was held in a sterile boardroom with frosted glass windows and a single carafe of coffee no one touched. On the city's side sat two attorneys, one PR advisor and a deputy commissioner with tired eyes who didn't speak unless prompted. On Danielle's side, just her and Rena, folders spread open before them like quiet testimony. The lead city attorney began with rehearsed language acknowledging public concern, reiterating commitment to transparency, hinting at resolution avenues. Danielle waited until he paused, then spoke with a calm that didn't ask permission. This isn't about one man, she said. This is about every door closed after someone knocked. The commissioner looked up then, for a moment. His face wore neither defense nor denial, just fatigue. You want to burn it all down? She shook her head slowly. No, I want you to admit it's already been burning. I'm just not pretending I don't see the smoke anymore. The room fell quiet. They didn't reach agreement that day, and Danielle didn't expect one. What mattered was that she'd said it aloud, that it had been heard even if it made them uncomfortable, especially because it made them uncomfortable. On the way out, Rena touched her arm gently. They didn't see you coming. Danielle smiled, just barely. Good, that's the only way truth gets through the front door. Later that night, a national outlet ran an op-ed by a retired federal judge titled, Why This Lawsuit Could Change More Than One Career. It didn't name her directly in the title but quoted her halfway through the line. She'd said to the commissioner, "It's already been burning." The quote went viral within an hour. People shared it with their own captions. Some called it powerful, others dangerous. One woman reposted it with, "Finally, someone saying what we all knew." Danielle read the comments for a while, then closed the screen and sat quietly in the dark. Outside, the wind picked up, stirring the trees beyond her window. She didn't know what would happen tomorrow, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was holding her breath. She had spoken, and now they had no choice but to listen. The courtroom didn't feel like a place of justice that morning. It felt like a waiting room for history, thick with the breath of people, unsure how much truth they were ready to witness. The air was crisp with early fall, cold enough to sting but not enough to numb it completely. Danielle sat near the front, shoulders square, spine straight, hands clasped loosely in her lap, not in prayer, not fear, but stillness. She wore a dark gray suit, understated, unassuming, the kind of fabric that didn't wrinkle under pressure. Around her, whispers drifted like smoke, reporters murmuring about turnout, lawyers shuffling papers, citizens clutching notebooks as if writing could anchor them to the moment. Hale entered from a side door, flanked by his legal team. He looked thinner than the last time she'd seen him, or maybe just smaller. His uniform was gone, replaced by a navy suit, collar simple but slightly crooked. His eyes darted toward her for a second before retreating to the floor. She didn't flinch. She didn't need to. There was nothing in his glance she hadn't seen before. No regret, no ownership, just a tired calculation of optics. The judge arrived next, a man in his late 60s, with weary eyes and a voice that cut through the room like gravel under pressure. He didn't seem interested in politics or pity, just a man who'd heard too many lies to pretend he hadn't. The proceedings began with opening statements, each side laying out narratives with practiced control. Danielle's attorneys framed the case not as a personal grievance but a reckoning, a thread pulled from a fabric frayed too long. The city's counsel leaned on caution, offering acknowledgement without admission, concern without consequence. They referred to her lawyer as the agent, rarely by name, as if saying Danielle might give her presence more weight than they were willing to concede. She listened quietly, face composed but alert. Every word passed through her like radio signals, some absorbed, some discarded, all familiar. It wasn't the facts that exhausted her, it was the choreography. how each phrase was designed not to illuminate but to manage. This wasn't about truth, it was about control. And the courtroom, for all its walls and wood, was just another arena where systems performed fairness while fighting to preserve their shape. The first witness took the bystander from the park. Evelyn Chase, a woman in her 70s, with a voice steady and lined with clarity born from living through enough silence to know what matters when you speak. She recounted the event with precision, how Danielle never raised her voice, never moved aggressively, how Hale's reaction felt unprovoked, out of proportion. "I've seen arguments," Evelyn said, voice steady but soft. "That wasn't an argument, that was a man trying to put someone in their place." The courtroom was silent, no one objected. Danielle didn't move. One by one, more witnesses testified. A jogger who'd paused on the trail, catching the altercation's end. A civil rights expert discussing statistical patterns in internal cover-ups. An ethics investigator who'd reviewed Danielle's case files, noting how key documents were consistently suppressed or redacted under vague pretexts. Each voice added weight, not drama. Each piece was meant to reveal, not provoke. Then it was Danielle's turn. She rose slowly, walked to the stand with calm steps, and took the oath with a voice that didn't waver. Her testimony was quiet, direct, human. She didn't tell the story for effect, she told it as it happened. From the moment she saw Hale step from his cruiser to the second her phone hit the pavement. She described the pain in her wrist not as a wound, but as a symbol. The fracture wasn't physical, it was institutional. She spoke of the silence that followed, the slow violence of bureaucracy, unanswered emails, avoided questions. "The hardest part," she said, "was not the moment I was kicked. It was realizing how many people expected me to stay quiet after it happened." She didn't cry, she didn't raise her voice. But by the end, the room had shifted. Even the reporters had stopped typing. Examination came quickly, sharper, probing her intent. The city's lawyer asked if she'd considered that Hale might have felt threatened, that her posture could have been misread. Danielle's eyes stayed steady. "If my standing still made him feel threatened," she said, "then that's the problem, not me." The lawyer backed off. When she stepped down, her legs felt heavier than when she'd walked up. But there was no hesitation in her strident gravity, the weight of saying truth aloud, knowing it couldn't be unsaid. Outside the courthouse, media gathered like birds sensing a storm's approach. Microphones raised, questions shouted, camera lenses reaching for her face. But she didn't stop to speak. She didn't need to. The testimony had echoed beyond those walls, replayed, transcribed, quoted in articles and threads. She'd done what she came to do. Back in her car, alone for the first time in hours, she let her hands rest on the steering wheel for a long moment before starting the engine. The sky was darkening, clouds folding into each other like hands pressed in prayer. A drizzle tapped the windshield light, but steady. She didn't drive away right away. She let the sound wash over her, steady and soft. In that quiet, Danielle realized something unexpected. Not relief, not victory, but peace. Not because justice was done, not yet, but because she'd stood in the one room they thought they controlled and spoken without flinching. And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It didn't happen all at once. There was no grand gavel bang or breaking news alert declaring justice had landed. What happened came slowly, like light spilling through a crack in a door left just wide enough. The judge's ruling came on a Thursday morning in a courtroom filled more with quiet tension than loud expectation. It wasn't explosive, it was deliberate, detailed, worded with care. Only someone who knew each syllable's cost could deliver. The court acknowledged excessive force, cited systemic failures, listed omissions, patterns, and the people who'd looked away when they should have leaned in. Danielle stood in the back, not sitting, not settling into hopes, cushion she'd learned to hold hope with gloves on. But when the ruling finished, when the clerk's voice stilled and the room stayed hushed, she didn't move right away. Her breath stayed slow, even there was no cheer, no applause, no reporters sprinting for the door, just a shift. Subtle but real, the kind that says, now they can't pretend they didn't know. Outside, the sky was overcast, same as the day. She filed. Clouds hung like wet wool, heavy, not breaking. Rina walked beside her, silent at first, the kind of companion who didn't fill silence with empty words. After a few steps, she asked gently, "You okay?" Danielle nodded. "I'm not sure what okay feels like right now." Rina smiled. Amusement, but understanding. "Then maybe this is what healing looks like when it starts quiet." They reached the sidewalk, and Danielle paused. Across the street a small crowd had gathered, not media, but people, citizens, community leaders, students holding printed signs with simple phrases like "We believe you" and "Truth matters." An older man in a windbreaker tipped his cap when their eyes met. A young girl waved wide-eyed, clutching a notebook. Danielle didn't wave back. Instead, she placed her hand over her chest once and gave a soft nod, the kind that meant thank you without saying it. She wasn't used to being seen not like this, not as a figure. But maybe that was the point. She didn't have to be a symbol, she just had to be real. Later that evening, she walked the neighborhood trail where it all started. Leaves were falling, a soft rustle brushing the path with each step. The bench where she'd stood firm was still there, worn at the edges, metal armrests cold beneath the dusk. She sat, finally letting the memory return, not to relive it, but to reclaim it. She could still see him, Hale, standing there in his posture of practiced power, tone heavy with assumption. But now, with time and truth's distance, his figure held no weight. He'd been suspended pending further investigation. Internal reviews were underway for supervisors who'd buried complaints. Finn had quietly resigned. The city committed to new transparency policies and community oversight. Not perfect, not everything, but more than before. As the sun slipped below the trees, painting the sky in fading orange, Danielle closed her eyes and breathed in the air, cool, clean, steady. She wasn't thinking about what came next, wasn't bracing for another fight or planning another step. For once, she let herself exist without defense, without urgency, just a woman on a bench with a full heart and an open sky. A jogger passed, slowed briefly, and smiled. "Hey," he said, "you're her, right?" Danielle turned, brow lifted. "Her who?" "The agent," he said. "The one who stood up." She looked at him a moment, then shrugged lightly. "I stood. But not just for me," he nodded. "Not needing more," well, he said, jogging again. "You changed something." As he disappeared down the path, she felt the wind shift around her shoulders, lifting her coat's collar, and maybe, just maybe, she believed him. That night, back home, she poured a cup of tea and sat by the window. City lights blinked softly in the distance. Somewhere in the apartment below, someone played jazz through old speakers, mellow low, like a saxophone exhaling memory. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She let the cup's warmth in her hands and the air's rhythm remind her that justice isn't a moment, it's motion. And sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to look away. That night Danielle Porter slept through until morning. No nightmares, no knocking, just rest. The kind earned, not granted. The kind that comes when truth stops knocking and walks right through the front door. What happened to Danielle Porter wasn't just one woman's fight. It was a mirror held to a system that too often asks for silence instead of truth. Her story reminds us that standing still in the face of injustice can be more powerful than raising a fist. And real change doesn't always come with applause, it comes with persistence, paper trails, and the quiet courage to speak when the world hopes you won't. For those watching, especially in our later years, we've seen enough to know justice doesn't happen by accident. It's earned by step, truth by truth. Maybe you've faced moments like Danielle's, or maybe you've stayed quiet when it wasn't safe to speak. Either way, it's never too late to believe the truth still matters. That one voice, calm, clear, unshaken, can move mountains. Others spent decades burying. So, if this story moved you, if it reminded you of something worth standing for, don't let it end here. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and hit subscribe so we can keep bringing stories like this into the light. Your voice, your presence, your belief in dignity and justice, they matter. Because the more we share truth, the harder it is for the world to look away.